live chat. Okay. Right. Okay, so right, today I thought we'd talk about a couple of different things, because and unfortunately I'm also going to have to go at about 3 because my wife is still sick. She's been sick for 2 weeks now, and so I'm responsible for our children, so I'll have to go and pick them up at 3. But I thought we'd talk about a couple of things. One was GDPR. So, what do you guys know about GDPR? Do you know what GDPR is? Okay. So, at the moment, this is probably not something that, obviously, not all of you guys are thinking about actively at the moment. But the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, is a European legislation that's coming through, which affects how we handle personal data. Right?
Is it 20th of May?
It's like the 18th of May, yeah. It's May this year, right? So by the time you finish your degree, this will be in force in Europe. Okay, so this is, you know, up-to-date, current, real stuff happening now. And GDPR basically is laws around how you store, process, acquire data about people, right? So anything that's vaguely personal data. And it's both controllers and processors. And by that we mean, like, controllers are the people who collect and manage the data, and processors are you guys who write code that interact with that data. Right? So it covers what the jobs you're likely to be involved in. The fines are bigger than they used to be. So the new fines are 20 million euro for failure to comply, up to 20 million euro, or 4% global revenue. So if your company earns more than whatever 4% to 20 million 4% is, so 4% must be something like $50 billion, whatever it is. So if your company's earning $500 billion a year or more, then their fines can go up from there. Right? So, $5 billion or more. So the GDPR, basically, why I want to bring it up is it fits into a general professionalism in the way you do things. And it also affects technology people, because if you don't process the information correctly, right, and follow the process that you're supposed to follow, and store things in the way they're supposed to be stored, and delete things in the way they're supposed to, and actually delete them, then yes, the company you work for could be liable for up to 20 million euro fine. Now, that will probably destroy most companies you work for. Right? There are a few big companies there where that won't destroy them, but you might lose your job. Right? I had, and I don't know if I've told you guys this story, but one of my colleagues from high school, he was working as an IT consultant. He was working in an IT role in a large distribution company in New Zealand. Right? So they were a paper distributor, and the paper and office supplies, right? And he was working in the on the mainframe. He was their system admin. Okay, so got his degree, was system admin. And one night he got drunk and logged in remotely from home, and was kind of showing off how much power he had, and so did the RM star and saying, if I hit enter, I could screw the company. And he was drunk and it was partying, and either someone bumped him or they pressed enter, or he was a bit drunk, he doesn't know what happened. But he RM starred the root directory of the mainframe. He then Control-C, right? Hit Control-C to stop the deleting of files from the root directory of the mainframe. But by that stage it was too late, right? Because it had already removed some of the booting files. Which means on Saturday morning, the next morning, the mainframe wouldn't come up and wouldn't operate. So for the entire country, they had to go to manual logging of transactions. And their credit card machine wouldn't work because it connected the inventory. All their sales had to go through manually writing them down, and the big old swipe machines with the carbon paper for credit cards for 3 days while they got the operators in from Australia, because we're in New Zealand, in from Australia to reinstall the mainframe to get it back up and working.
Oh, did I work back up?
Hmm?
Did they have a backup there?
Oh, so no, he didn't delete any of the data. It just the machine wouldn't boot because it was the root directory and he deleted the root files. So they had to reinstall those, but it took 3 days to get it all back. Right? He lost his job. You can probably imagine. He went back to university, changed his name, got a new degree, and moved to Australia. Right? Because that sort of shit is career ending. So basically, yes, he ended his career under that name, went back to university and created a new identity and got a new degree so he wouldn't have to refer to his previous employment. Right? You don't want to have to be that guy. And if you do something that gets your company fined, even 10 million euro, none of you are worth that much. I would say at the moment. Maybe one day you could be, but at the moment you're probably not worth 10 million euro. To keep at least, after you've made that kind of mistake, they're not going to keep you. So, understanding the liability that you could cause a company and understanding, don't screw up so much that you have to go and get a new degree. Understanding some of these requirements. So the GDPR is around data protection. So any time you process personal data, right, there are a bunch of regulations around what rights the user has and how you're allowed to process and store that and how you have to be able to delete it upon request. Okay, so the general rule, and I won't go too deep into it because if you want to, you can go to the EU's GDPR, European General Data Protection Regulation. So you can, there's lots of resources. I found a nice presentation, so GDPR, and if you look at presentation, and it was, where was it? So one of the ways I do is I kind of, my process for finding out stuff, if I want to find a PowerPoint presentation of something, because rather than going and reading the GDPR huge documentation, finding a university lecturer or someone like that who's done a presentation on it, probably better. And rather than just GDPR presentation, you guys are developers, so let's put in developer. And you can start looking, okay, it's practical guide, right, so there's the blog, that looks pretty good, and I actually think I put in programmer, I think, and where's slide share? So, yep, so this is one I found, so, so go looking for presentations, and from presentations that usually gives you a nice summary of what's going on, right? So rather than you waiting for me to tell you how all these things work, you should find ways of finding them. And this particular one, so on SlideShare here, she's a technical director, not a lawyer, so it's quite a good presentation. And under her presentation, she takes you through some of the overview, what it is. I think the key thing here is she does the whole yes, infringement's 20 million euro. Pay attention. And it takes you through a presentation of you know, what it means for programmers. Right? So some of the things that they talk about is when you ask people for data now, you've got to say it's got to be active process. They have to, that you can't be a tick box that says okay, right? They have to affirm that they understand what the data is being used for. Right? So they've said it has to be active, and it has to be between them and you, right? So you have to say who you are, how you're going to use the data, and how long it's going to be stored for, basically, and you affirm for each one of those. Right? So if you want to use the data for something else, you're not allowed to. Right? You've got to ask a new time, say, oh, we collected this data, now we want to use it for this purpose. We have to go back and make sure that person says yes to this new use of the new data, right? Of that data that I've collected. And we also have to, so that's collecting it, accessing data and free access of data. So when you've stored the data of someone in your system and they say, hey, I want to know all the data that you've got about me, you have to, for free, provide that data in an appropriate electronic format so that they can read it, and they have to be able to choose to delete all of that data. Right? So you have to have a way that they can delete it, you have to have a way that they can access it. You even have to have a way that they can migrate it to other systems. Right? So for example, for Blackboard, right? If we're putting stuff in Blackboard, in the learning management system here, GDPR would say that if you guys changed school, went from NTNU to a different school that was using its learning, you could use GDPR to tell us to provide you all documentation that we have about you in a form that you can load into its learning. Right? Which currently Blackboard won't do. So come the 18th of May, you could probably sue the university for non-compliance with the GDPR because we don't have a migratable format for our internal data. Don't sue us. Again, that whole look bad. Like, you want me to recommend you after you've sued us? Yeah, he's a good student, but yeah. So no, I shouldn't say that. But no, So this new regulation is causing a lot of problems across a lot of companies currently, right? So even the Norwegian tax department is a bit concerned because it doesn't know how it's supposed to do tax with this new regulation, because there's a bunch of things it's then not allowed to store, or for how long it's allowed to store tax information about you. But so actually it made it much worse for Norwegians because they now have to provide the correct information. The tax office can, at that moment, check it, because then they're not storing it, they're just validating it. Which means if you get anything wrong, they can ping you for getting it wrong. Because in the past, they used to collect all the data about you and store all the data about Norwegians, and then work out how much your tax you're supposed to pay, tell you, oh, you're supposed to pay this much, you just go, okay, and pay it, and everything was fine. If the government made a mistake, it was their problem, because they collected all the data. Now, it's your job to make sure you've collected all your data and provide it accurately, which means if you make a mistake, they can fine you for non-reporting of taxable income. So it has made your life much worse because now you have to do your own tax returns. As software engineers, there's going to be a lot of work in fixing and refactoring systems to become compliant with GDPR. Why does that matter? Well, in this presentation, and I can show you what she's talking about, data breaches. So if you want, you should go through this presentation as well. But so I think, yeah. So what's bothering her about all of this is that, you know, it's a 90-10, right? So 90% of the work is in 10% to get 10% of the result. If you had this situation where you had a website and a content management system or customer relationship storage, that would be fine, right? Because your website, store everything in one database. Someone asked you to remove something, you remove it. Right? That looks nice and pretty and simple. That's not how any company really works. Right? Modern software development, you're going to have a bunch of entities operating. Right? You're going to have multiple databases. You're going to have potentially, and she's showing here, search as a service. Right? So some people have that search in the top corner of their website, like powered by Google. That's because it's powered by Google, because Google will search your website for you. Now that's search as a service, which means that any customer who puts data in there and searches for themselves, or while logged in searches for something, that search also has the URL and has additional information that gets sent to Google about where you're searching from, so that Google knows what to do. And so suddenly you've leaked personal information to a third party. And if I want to remove all of the searches that I did, you now have to get Google to delete parts of Google's history. Google doesn't do that sort of shit, right? So suddenly you're non-compliant because you use software as a service. You guys are using libraries, so you're using OpenStreetMaps, right? If you're using the Google Maps, the reason why you don't want to use Google Maps is because you don't want to share location with Google all the time, right? Because that's a privacy concern for the company you're working for, right? Anytime you do any external service, any library you guys use could be in breach of GDPR because you're leaking data, data's being processed and stored outside of the company, and when somebody wants access to it or wants to remove it or wants to you to collect it and give it to them, you can't. Which could mean for you guys as programmers, there's a lot of things which are currently done, software as service, which might need to be programmed by you. Right? So this could mean there's a whole bunch more software engineering work to be done because you can't just use third-party libraries for everything. Okay, so real databases don't look so simple. When you guys talk to lawyers, have any of you talked to a lawyer? Eva? You've talked to a lawyer. Excellent. Did you try and explain computers to them? No. Most lawyers, when you try and explain how software as a service works, or how low-level database caching works between your servers and your clients and your deployment server and your Git repository and your continuous integration server, they don't know any of the words you've just used, and so have no idea what you're talking about. And so you simplify it and you say, oh, it looks a bit like this, because that's what the lawyer can understand. You don't explain this diagram to them. The problem is the GDPR requires you to explain this diagram and be able to pull apart the data from that, right? And separate out how your data is being processed, how long you store it for, how you're processing it, who has access to the processing of it. All of that needs to be managed. So if you're using Trello, right, you could leak something about a person in a Trello issue, right? Because if you have an issue with a particular, which user did this issue come up for, right? So, you know, you got a bug, some user tried to do something, there was a bug, you registered that bug, it put into a Trello card, suddenly, you know, that user's data is now stored on a remote server. And if that user says, hey, I want you to remove everything about me, you have to make sure that Trello empties its caches. Like, do you know how to do that? Are you sure that it will be completely removed once you've removed it? Dropbox. Do any of you use Dropbox? Good, excellent. Do you remember? Did you see the discussion where Dropbox leaked a whole bunch of data to a bunch of Russians? Because they were storing stuff unencrypted on whatever hardware people were offering. So there were a bunch of Russian developers, and we think the Russian KGB equivalent, what they are now. What's the KGB changed its name to? FSB. Right. Yeah. Had offered data storage to Dropbox. So Dropbox were using their data storage. and storing people's data unencrypted on those servers. And so they just looked at it all because, hey, it was there. And so a whole bunch of data leaked because you guys stored it in the cloud. It's just the cloud happened to be sitting in Russia unencrypted. So Dropbox kind of had to change and said, oh no, okay, right, we'll try and encrypt things. But some of their neat things that people have done with Dropbox to try and find out stuff. So I saw with the way Dropbox was storing information, because there isn't enough storage in the world to provide all the storage that they provide for people, right? So you think number of users and the amount of gig that those users are using, there isn't that amount of storage in the world. So how do they do it? Well, they store one copy of a file and then the hash, and they see if you have the hash to that one copy of a file. So for example, if you drop a movie into your Dropbox, that's a copyrighted movie, they hash that movie and go, oh, right, okay, so that's, Batman. Well, Batman versus Superman or whatever, right? Oh, that guy, all have identical hashed file. I'll just store it in one place and store that they have hashes that access that. Right? Because, I can store it once and then offer it to all of those people. So if any of you have a file that's identical to other people's files, they can just store that once and just give all of you a hash to that file. Right? Which means if you've downloaded a PDF, or you download a TV show, or you download a Linux install, right, and you put it in your Dropbox, that is already existing somewhere. So instead of storing it, they just have a hash to where it's actually stored, like the version they already have of it. Right? So they just have one copy of every file in the world and just keep the hash of who's got access to it. One of the neat hacks I saw on this was they were trying to work out how much someone was paid. And so they found this form offer letter, which was in a PDF form offer letter, and just put in different amounts until it gave them an earlier hash number, because you used to be able to get the document ID number from searching in the Dropbox type information, and you could see if this was a new document no one ever stored before, or if it was a previous document that had been stored. So the goal was you put the name of the person and the amount of money in, and you just keep storing that file, changing the amount of money until you get an old hash. And if you get an old hash, aha, that file's been stored already. So I know that person was offered that amount of money at some point in the past. Clever attack, right? But this idea, so anytime you use Dropbox, anytime you do OneDrive, anytime you do it, you are using cloud service, you are leaking data. So as programmers, when you use third-party tools, now suddenly when you're deciding on what tool to use, you can't just say, oh, this is the easiest tool to use, this is the fastest tool to use, oh, I use this at school, it'll be fine. Right? You may be exposing your company to a massive fine because you're leaking data. Right? You're leaking personal data. So, and that can be, Microsoft Azure. Residual data. Data leaves traces. Basically the idea that through all of this complex mesh of things, you guys know there are logs everywhere, right? You know that, where every time you access the internet, every time you go, that people Google is recording lots of your stuff from your ad monitoring, right? I go and buy a hard drive and then suddenly all the ads change to adverts for hard drives on my Facebook and stuff. You've noticed this too? The weird ones are where you buy something where you only need one of them. You buy a car and then starts advertising you more cars. And think, no, I just bought a car. Not like I'm going to buy more cars. I've just spent all of the car money on one. This doesn't make sense. But, obviously I'm interested in buying cars now. So everything you do at university, right? They can log and are logging all you do. Up until May, and then we have to decide exactly how much we're logging and why we're logging it. Luckily, we can actually justify why we log some of the activity you do, But you know, there are regulations. We have to abide by the regulations. If you want to know what's been recorded from your login, you can ask, and we're supposed to provide you that information for free within a week. So you know, it's a problem. And if we wanted to remove that, some of that's really hard to do because it's integrated into a log file. And some of the big challenges are, if you were having a social, like a Facebook chat or a social chat, right? So if you know you're having an email discussion with some of the IT staff, and they've stored their emails, and you want to delete all the information we carry about you, do we delete all those emails? Do we delete your half of those emails? Do we go in there and just have our half of the conversation with you, and then delete your half of the conversation? Like, what exactly does that mean? And if you ask us to delete it and then complain about our service and we have no records about giving you that information, what do we do? Right? How? We still don't know. So with the removing of these old records, you guys as programmers have to be thinking about how you process data. Right? Any data that could be indirect personal data, direct personal data, or sensitive data. Now, if you're recording sensitive data, so if any of you guys in your bachelor theses record anything about health data, or even things like union membership or religious status, anything like that, you could be processing personal data, and that in Norway has even higher restrictions on what you're allowed to do. If you're recording date of birth, age, home address, those are all personal data, and you have to get permission, active permission from the user to do this. Right? So they have to know what you're using it for and how long it will be stored for. And even if you're doing indirect, like IP addresses are considered indirect personal data. So if any of you are logging users' IP addresses when they come in, or using any service that logs IP addresses, you have to get approval for that, and you're subject to this processing. Right? So already now, some of you will be triggering some of these. Right? Technically, any of you who ask a user's opinion about something are collecting data that could be personal. Right? So, and this is not just in theory in the future. This is probably right now. You guys might be on the edge of dealing with this. Basically, for the logging, we don't know how to deal with the logging of data. We were just having that discussion earlier downstairs, and they were agreeing, we've got multiple legislations. They're telling us to do two completely different things. So in Norway, there's a data logging thing. So we've got to record a bunch of information about your access to the internet, because Norway wants to check, if terrorist activities occur. We're supposed to record all of the interactions you had and which websites you went to, and test, in case you went to terrorist websites, we can do some anti-terrorism things. At the same time, we're not allowed to record any of that about you for privacy reasons. So which is it? Is it anti-terrorism or is it privacy? Which one do you want? Because apparently, realistically, we can't do both. How do you deal with backups? We don't know. We're all going to have to work this out. The best we can do is say refactoring the way in which we do work to allow users, from a data perspective, to manage their data. Right? So when you do this refactoring, you have to be thinking about the data and making sure the data is easily accessed. So if you go and have a look at that presentation, the other thing, seeing I've only got another 15 minutes left, the other thing I wanted to show was that one of you very kindly was talking about refactoring code, and I didn't actually have a refactoring code page down here. So I had some stuff on code styles, and where did it go? Okay, I have to make this smaller. Testing. Oh, I'm sure I saved it. Did I not save my recent update? So I need to find, login. that. Ah, I'm in Firefox. So the people online won't see this. So in the professional programming, there it is, code reviews. Right, so it was under code reviews. That's where it should go. And I'll go back. So I put it under code reviews rather than code reviews. Put a link to Marcus. Who's okay? None of you are Marcus. Marcus suggested this. He might be one of the remote students. Hi, Marcus. This one as a link to Refactoring Code, as a book on refactoring code and on how to refactor code. Right? So as a resource for you guys to look up, thinking, well, what are the techniques, right? What's the line-by-line technique of refactoring code? How do I refactor code without changing significantly what it does? Right. So last week when we did the refactoring of that modulus, right, where we removed the modulus and made one of a check, another time we removed a branching thing and turned it into a modulus. We actually evolved the code a little bit then. That wasn't just a clean refactoring, because one of the things we did is we made the code better so it actually ran on more cases, but that actually evolves functionality. That changed what the code does. If you're in a business and they say, no, we need the code to do this, and if you refactor it, it better still do that, right? Then evolving your code, making the code do more than it used to do, is a different thing to just fixing what it does. So in that book it discusses both of those, and it discusses the techniques for refactoring, when you should evolve code and when you shouldn't. The other thing I wanted to point out was in this ISO standards. So how many, so have you guys talked about ISO standards in other courses? Which ISO standards have you talked about?
7001 or 000 2005. That's exactly what that is.
Yep, so 2005 for the security.
Yeah, from 0 to 5, I think.
Yep.
Time and date.
ISO time and date standards, excellent. Yep. So ISO does a whole bunch of stuff, right? So one, they have the security. There's also a bunch of stuff around software engineering. If you are developing like an application that's going to be a healthcare application, there's an ISO standard you have to follow to be accredited. Has a lot to do with the process by which you write code. Right? Now, this particular software systems and engineering work product reviews. So when we're doing code reviews, this is a document specifically about describing what code reviews are and how to use them. Right? So there's the ISO standard review process. So within this ISO cross online portfolio, you'll find, well, yeah, so this one, if you want the full one, I think we have it in the library, because you have to pay for some of these standards. Which is annoying, but I think we can get them through the library. But what I wanted to show, and the thing is, in terms and definitions, what you can see here, and maybe if I make it larger you can actually see it, they define a whole bunch of reviewing techniques, and even from those definitions you can work out some of the things that are going on here. So 3.1, ad hoc review, unstructured independent review technique. That's you reviewing yourself at some point because I felt like going and look at the code I had done previously, right? So that's probably the lowest level of unstructured, unorganized. An author check, an informal review performed by the author of the work. So this is you saying, oh yeah, no, it was me who was checking, rather than I was just looking around at other people's code and just seeing what was there. So this is me specifically looking at mine. 3.3, buddy check. Buddy is an ISO standard. So a buddy check is your friend looks at your code. A checklist-based review, where and we'll look at this in terms of code reviews, and this is one of the techniques you guys can ask for us to do, is to look through a checklist of things to identify. Right? So one of the things you could do in a code review is boundary conditions could be on the list, and so you go through, have we checked all the boundary conditions? Tick. Right. Variable naming, check all the variable names, tick. Function descriptions, check. Function commenting, check. Right, so you could review code that had a bunch of those standards. Yes?
someone on the watching the stream said that he wasn't able to watch the screen, but it might have been an old message.
Ooh. Ah! It did. No, it wasn't an old message. For some reason, Firefox turned itself off. Okay. It's back on. Thank you, stream, for speaking up. There we go. The ISO standard on 3.5 is a formal review. So more than checklists, it actually has a formal review. Formal review following a defined process with a formal documented output. Right, so the checklist review, we just check it. A formal review, we actually write something into the documentation. We reviewed this code and it's acceptable. Now, for some companies, until you've had your code reviewed by another group, you can't put it into production. Right? It has to be reviewed. I know in tax legislation in New Zealand, I don't know if this is the same in Skatteetaten here in Norway, but I had one of my students went and worked for the tax department. Once you worked for the tax department in New Zealand, for the next 5 years, all of your taxes were done by hand because they didn't trust that you hadn't manipulated the code of the tax system to like exclude your name or something, right? So they'd manually do your code, your taxes, because you touched the system. We can't trust the system anymore. So formally writing things down, quite important. Informal review process, informal group review. An inspection, a formal review of work product by identified to identify issues, which users defined team roles and measurement to improve review process. So this is if you have an inspection team, like you might have a security inspection team, and so they will come in and inspect your code for security issues. Right, so that could be a code review. That would be an inspection. Right, so basically all of these terms are defined in standards. Right, so the main point of saying this is, as a professional, understanding that almost everything you do, there will be standards associated with it. Right, there'll be some professionalism that you can go and reference. If you are handling personal data, understand that the GDPR is coming in. Understand that NSD does our personal ethics, right? So the research ethics in NTNU is done by NSD. If you're processing data, you have to get approval. If you are coding and doing reviews, there are standards for this. It becomes more and more important as you work in larger and larger companies and bigger contracts that you adhere to standards and that you can point to the reason why you did something, right? Because one of the important things about professionalism is that attitude of being able to justify what you've done, rather than, oh, I did it because it was the easiest thing to do, right? Isn't usually a good enough justification, right? If you can say, oh, I did it because of that, then at least you have some valid argument you can make for why you've done what you've done, right? And if the regulations change, because you're referring to regulation, you can change what you do, right? If you just have it in your head and just do whatever feels natural to you, then if regulations change, you can't keep up because you're just doing things out of your own head, right? So sometimes you need to go and look, and these regulations do change. Certainly the GDPR is new. It's coming in June, so that's a new thing. But it will keep changing. There'll be new laws in Norway coming through that interact with it. There'll be new protections coming through in Europe. So don't just rely on what we teach you to think about. When you do this, you have to search for it and have to find what you're doing. Okay? So, in summary, if you are going to be doing any reviewing your code from a data perspective, you will have to understand the laws by which your code is governed. Right? And we're moving beyond, I just tacked it up because I needed the grade in the course, into the, if I get this wrong, I could kill the company. Right? It's also not ethical to intentionally leak data to kill your company. Right? We've had so one of our EU projects has released an app, but one of the partners has ex-employees who were not happy about being ex-employees, and so they've gone onto the app and given it really bad reviews to bring down its rating. That's unethical. Right? Just because you've had a dispute with your employer doesn't mean you can go and rubbish all of their products ethically as a programmer. Right? Even if you just like them, you can't just go and hate on them. Right? That's not professional. That's not a professional approach to what you do. And the same for storing code. You shouldn't back up all your company's software on your own personal Dropbox account so that when you leave, you've got all their code so you can sell it to a competitor. That's also unethical. Right? You don't do that sort of thing.
That's illegal in the last part, isn't it?
And generally illegal, yes. But even if it wasn't illegal, it would be unethical. Right? So just because something's illegal sometimes means they just haven't got round to making it illegal yet, because the law takes a while to change. And so you guys are probably always going to be ahead of the law in terms of your understanding of technology. So you are in a privileged position where you know how this data protection stuff works, right? You know how the underlying systems work, whereas most users don't, right? And so you're in this privileged information situation where you know how to extract data or how to store data or how like what is actually going on, whereas most users won't, right? So with that means that ethically you shouldn't try and actively utilize that to screw other people over, right? So yeah, don't be an arsehole is my message for the day. But also think about the GDPR, think about any personal data you're using in any of the applications you're using, and how you're processing it, right? Because you might fall under this and you might be liable for a fine. Right? So I'd rather you guys don't get fined the first time out of university. Okay, questions?
How does this apply to people outside the EU?
Right, so they're working with US companies to try and work out how they deal with US companies storing stuff and not being compliant with GDPR but operating in Europe. So they're still, as far as I can tell, working out how to deal with that. Basically, the US companies are saying, we don't really care about your laws. And so no, US companies will not comply with the GDPR, but their European subsidiaries do have to comply. So that's still a tension about where the data is stored and how it's being processed. Norway accepts most European laws, so it is integrating the GDPR into its privacy legislation, but it doesn't automatically apply, whereas in Europe it's not a directive, it's a regulation, which means it applies to all European countries immediately. So yeah, the edges are the challenge, right? So they're also changing the safe haven regulations in Europe around privacy and data, but again there's this border issue, and here in Norway we're outside of that border, so we actually have some. So because we're accepting the GDPR, we can be included and provide services within Europe and still be considered within Europe because we're aligning with the law. But the Europeans won't be, the Americans won't be considered within Europe for the purposes of data transmission and stuff. So yeah, it's a tricky edge. As a researcher, if you guys collect, as a researcher, if I went to the UK and collected data within the UK from UK citizens, I still have to follow Norwegian law, right? So if your company is operating in Norway and you're collecting data about people in China, you still have to follow the Norwegian laws about their privacy, right? Even though they don't have that protection because you're here, you have to provide that protection to them, right? So yeah, if you want to do it, you might have to create a subsidiary in China that is legally detached from you, that you then contract. So there are ways to try and firewall off internationals.
If Google, for instance, has server in America and then one in Europe,
Yep.
the European server probably has to be in line with the laws, but not the American one.
Yes.